Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and this is going to be another Q&A video where I'm going to answer 10 questions from the post that I made on the YouTube community page. So the first question here is frequency. A great way of meeting your weekly volume without accumulating too much fatigue is to increase frequency. Assuming the number of total weekly sets is unaffected, what is the downside of higher frequency? Can you train too frequently? And is the answer different depending on if you are training for strength or hypertrophy? Great question here, and we can go into a lot of detail with frequency, but basically, like this person said, frequency is simply a way of distributing the total amount of volume throughout the week. So there's nothing special about higher or lower frequencies, at least for hypertrophy training. However, frequency can definitely have an impact on other training variables. So the more skill-based something is, generally higher frequencies are going to be more beneficial, whereas qualities that aren't very skill-based probably aren't going to differ very much with different frequencies. For example, if we have a look at something outside of lifting, for example, let's say a basketball player practicing free throws. Are they going to be better off practicing 100 free throws in one day of the week, or are they going to be better off practicing 20 free throws throughout 5 days throughout the week? Generally, they're going to be better off using a higher frequency approach because it just gives them more exposure to that skill over time. And if we compare this to something like hypertrophy training, there's no real skill component. We're just trying to get some structural adaptations and just fatigue and tax the muscles that we're trying to train. So going back to the question, can you train too frequently, or what is the downside to higher frequencies? I'd say at least for strength and hypertrophy training, you probably can train too frequently. For example, if you can only recover from 16 total sets per week for a certain muscle group, if you split that volume over 7 days, for example, you're only going to be doing 2 or 3 sets of training for that muscle group in each session. So I don't know if this will actually have any negative effects, but it could potentially just not be enough stimulus each session to actually cause muscle growth. It's hard to tell, I don't have the exact answer, but I would say just more from a practical sense, it might just be easier to slightly decrease your frequency to maybe 2 or 3 sessions per week, or maybe up to even 4 sessions, which is pretty easy to do, and it's probably not going to have any downsides. In terms of strength training for those neural adaptations, it's not really volume that's going to be driving that strength. It's going to be just the intensity and the specificity, so lifting heavy loads in the specific exercise that you want to get stronger at. So whatever volume you're doing for those lifts, I would say a higher frequency is probably better because strength lifts are slightly more skill-based. And one last point is that I don't think increasing frequency is a way to increase volume without accumulating fatigue. I think if you increase volume by increasing frequency, it's going to be more fatiguing. So the key point we need to understand with frequency is that volume should be the same. We aren't talking about frequency as increasing volume, we're talking about frequency as distributing a certain amount of volume throughout the week. Next question here is how to find maximum recoverable volume, because on training I feel good, but after 1 to 2 days I feel lots of fatigue. Another good question, and I think there is no real way to find maximum recoverable volume, it's just a trial and error thing. So if you're training, it feels really good for a week or so, and then you start to feel really fatigued and performance starts to drop off, then you're probably already at your maximum recoverable volume or even surpass that. When you're above what you can recover from, you may be able to recover from that for maybe a short period of time, but it accumulates over time. So it's more about how much total amount you're doing and how that plays out in the long term. So how to actually find your maximum recoverable volume, like I said, it's just trial and error. Try an entire block or an entire mesocycle of a certain volume and then see how you feel after that. Deload and then repeat. So if you're feeling pretty good and you feel like you can handle more volume, then maybe increase the volume for that particular muscle group, maybe by 1 to 2 sets. And then do another entire mesocycle or block of training again with that new increased volume. Don't just give it 1 or 2 weeks or 1 or 2 sessions trying out a new volume, because you can always get away with that in the short term, but over time it accumulates and that's when it gets to you. So slowly start ramping up the volume every single block in slow amounts. And then when you sort of find that you're not recovering from the training, deload, then drop back 1 to 2 sets in the next mesocycle and do the same process backwards to find where that sweet spot is. And that can also change over time. The other thing to note here is that we're probably looking more at systemic fatigue rather than individual muscle group maximum recoverable volume. So you may find really good growth for a certain muscle group from doing high volumes, but if you do that for all muscle groups at the same time, you're just going to systemically be doing too much to recover from. So here we're talking more about the total amount that you're doing in a training program rather than an individual muscle group. So the next question we have here is, I just wanted to ask, as someone who self-programs for powerlifting and strength training, where would it be best to learn? I fear as though my linear programming as a beginner lifter is nearing its end without a trainer. It is tough to tell if I'm overdoing my volume for my lifts. Generally, there seems to be clearer evidence on volume limits for hypertrophy growth, but for strength there doesn't seem to be much in the way of studies on what is too much volume. How would one tell if too much volume is too much from a strength perspective? So good question again, and probably the reason that there isn't a huge amount of data or studies on volume for powerlifting or for strength training is because volume isn't the key driver of strength. Volume is going to be the key driver of muscle growth, and we sort of know that from these emerging studies, and that can indirectly enhance strength in the long term, but we know that there are neural adaptations that enhance strength, which is going to be primarily driven, like we just said, by intensity and specificity. So there was one study that I recall on different volumes, and they recorded strength and hypertrophy outcomes after a long-term study, and they found that there was a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, but all groups, regardless of how much volume they trained, improved their 1RM on certain lifts by the same amount. So in the short term, if people just lift heavy in those specific lifts that they want to get better at, they're going to improve regardless of the volume. But in the long term, that's where hypertrophy comes into play, because we want to increase volume to grow that muscle, and the more muscle we have, the more potential we have to make that muscle stronger, because we have more structural tissue to actually teach how to produce force. So rather than thinking about volume driving strength, we probably want to use volume to drive muscle growth in the same way that any other trainee would, and then we use our heavy lifts as sort of the exercise to transfer all that muscle into specific strength. So generally with strength training, I like to program in each session maybe 1 to 2 top sets of an exercise, and then the other sets can be back off sets where you're accumulating volume, and the goal there is to start to grow muscle. So that way you're actually training those specific neural patterns from that specific heavy lift, and then the back off sets are going to be higher rep ranges, lighter loads, and more volume to then drive muscle growth, which will then over time transfer to those heavy strength lifts. So I'm sure there's plenty of powerlifting resources out there that I'm not familiar with. So I think if you explore, you can definitely find some good resources out there. Next question here is, can strength training be split into 2 30-minute sessions a day and be equally as effective as one 60-minute session? So the answer, I think, definitely is yes. I think if you do the same amount of work in the day, or for that matter throughout the week, it's going to have the same effect. It's just like we were talking about another way of distributing the volume across different frequencies, this time in the day rather than throughout the week. So I think increasing the frequency in something like that is probably highly impractical for most people, but I think if possible, it can probably have the equal effect, or if not, potentially a slightly beneficial effect. Because if you split your session into 2 30-minute sessions rather than one 60-minute session, you get that break in between to recover. So when you do the second half of that session, you're probably going to be in a fresher state and actually perform better than if you were to do all that same session in one block. Because in one session, at the start of the session, you're going to probably be less fatigued and be fresh and perform better. Towards the end of that session, we're probably going to be more fatigued and perform not quite as good as we were at the start of the session. Next question is, are you using specific days only for testing, in brackets 1, 3, 5 RM speed jumps, or you use the progression on these exercises from week to week as a guide? Really good question here, and I definitely prefer to do the second thing to what he said, which is using progression of the exercises over time or week to week as a gauge. If we're talking about field sport or team sport athletes, we don't often have much time with them, and it's really difficult to actually even organize testing weeks. A lot of the stuff I've been doing with athletes has been on the field, and it's going to be really difficult to not only develop strength in the first place, but let alone to test it. So whatever strength training we can do, and for that matter speed and plyometric and jumping and power work, I try and record everything as best as I can throughout the weeks, and then over time have a look at the progress and then we can see sort of trends in performance that way. And I think that's beneficial for two main reasons. Number one is we can see trends over time. If we just take two data points, there's always going to be slight variation in that exact session. If an athlete's feeling really good in one session and really fatigued and not good in another session, then that might not accurately reflect their actual ability, especially in something like speed or power where the margin of error is so small. Like we may only be seeing 0.1 or 0.2 of a second improvements in speed performance over time. And if we take one session where the athlete's feeling really good or one session where the athlete's not feeling good, that can be a margin of error of 0.2 seconds just from those fatigue levels. So it could potentially not give us a good indicator of where they really are. And the second reason is for feedback. I think giving athletes instant feedback on what they're doing is the best way of teaching them. For example, if we have an athlete sprint or jump, if they don't know how fast they're sprinting or how far they're jumping, they don't know if what they're doing is actually working, both in the short term and in the long term. If we can tell athletes instantly that they're improving their performance every single week, that's the best form of encouragement that they can have and gives them huge amounts of confidence in knowing what they're doing is actually working. And we can also use it exactly in the session as instant feedback for changing technical cues. For example, for sprinting, if we give them some technical cues and they all of a sudden run slightly faster, they can see that instantly and immediately know that what they did worked and can automatically learn to do those things that worked, rather than you trying to convince them that this is the best way to run or the best technique to use. So definitely like to track progress over time rather than using testing days. Next question is, what are your tips to build strong chin-ups/pull-ups? How to progress them when you can only do 3 to 10 bodyweight reps? Thanks. Another good question here, and me personally, I don't use chin-ups or pull-ups to get better at those lifts. I use those lifts as exercises for hypertrophy. So the way I would progress them is in exactly the same way as any other exercise. However, chin-ups and pull-ups for some reason seem to take a really long time to progress, and I only see very small improvements over time even after years of training them. So 3 to 10 bodyweight reps is quite a range. I'm not sure if he can only do 3 or he can only do 10, or he starts off one set doing 10 and then ends up doing 3 by the last set. So one thing I will say with pull-ups or chin-ups is that they seem to fatigue really quickly. They're really sensitive to fatigue. So if you don't give yourself enough rest between sets of pull-ups, your performance declines really quickly. So make sure when you're doing them, if you want to actually build strength at them, you have to give yourself full recovery, which can take 3, even up to 5 minutes if you're doing a lot of sets, so that your performance stays high and can still continue to get more reps. Another tip for pull-ups is that I've always preferred doing pull-ups in a lower rep range. I think once you sort of go above 10 reps, they become really difficult. They're really easy to cheat the reps. And personally, I just don't feel like they're giving as much as doing lower rep ranges, sort of in the 6 to 10 rep range. So I've always preferred to do lower reps with pull-ups and always do my first few sets weighted if I can. And then maybe your last 1 or 2 sets, you can do body weight to finish off. So I'm no calisthenics expert, but I think the way that my pull-ups have progressed over time is simply by just building up the back and arm muscles using pull-ups and other exercises, and then that eventually transfers to pull-ups later on, which obviously takes a really long time, but that's the only way I know how to progress them. So do your pull-ups and then also do plenty of accessory work for the back and the arms, and then over time, the more muscle you have, the more that should transfer the pull-ups. Even just going away from pull-ups for a couple of blocks at a time and focusing on other movements to get a different stimulus for those back and arm muscles, and then coming back to pull-ups and then slowly building back up, you might find that you're actually able to surpass your previous bests because now you have slightly more muscle mass. So there's some tips for pull-ups, but again, I'm no expert on pull-ups or calisthenics, so there's probably better resources out there for people aiming to maximize pull-up strength. Next question is how to decide your weekly volume. So this question I can go on forever talking about, but we sort of touched on it before. It's really just trial and error and seeing where you're at. So your weekly volume is going to be limited more likely by systemic fatigue rather than fatigue of an individual muscle. So I think pick a weekly volume, try that for an entire mesocycle and see how you respond from there. If you feel like your systemic fatigue is really high and your performance starts to decline by the end of the mesocycle, or your joints start to feel irritated, then you're probably doing too much weekly volume. Then deload, reduce that volume by a couple of sets per muscle group, try in another entire mesocycle, see how you feel. And then use the same indicators. If you feel systemically okay, your performance is still consistent or slightly improving, and your joints don't feel sore, then that's probably around a good weekly volume. So you just need to use trial and error, and that value can change pretty significantly over time. Next question here, we have 2 questions in one, and I'll see if I can answer both of them. Question 1, I am a beginner in hypertrophy but also want to strength gains. That's why we all go to the gym, right? How can one do this? Question 2, I am lifting very heavy loads, 70 to 80% 1RM in my first compound exercise for strength gain. Am I right or wrong, or am I overtraining? Another good question here, and I think it touches on some stuff we were talking about previously. But basically, hypertrophy and strength are 2 really compatible qualities, thankfully. And a lot of people want to get stronger and build muscle. So like we were talking about, strength is going to be driven, number 1, by neural adaptations, and number 2, by muscle growth over time. The bigger the muscle we have, the more muscle tissue we have to actually teach how to produce more force. So I think he's spot on here. He's doing his first compound exercise in the 70 to 80% 1RM range. And then I'm assuming the back off sets here are with more volume, which I think is the best way to go about it. I think 1 to 2 heavy sets, and it could be even heavier than this 70 to 80% 1RM, and then use back off sets to accumulate volume. And that way you're going to get the muscle growth using the higher rep ranges, and then you're going to get the neural adaptations from using the lower rep ranges with heavier loads. So basically it's like a hypertrophy program, but we're doing a couple of heavy sets at the start of each session for those specific neural adaptations. Next question here is how to train multiple things such as endurance, speed, and strength, block training, everything in 1 week, how to train everything and still get good results in all aspects without doing too much and without that one interferes negatively with another aspect. Also, how to combine the different aspects with team training when you're in season, in brackets soccer. Another good question here, and I think the answer here is vertical integration, like one of you commented as well. So what we need to understand when training multiple qualities at once is that we can't maximize every single quality at the same time. There is only a certain amount of total training that we can do in a given week or over a given time period and actually be able to recover and adapt to that. If we're doing too much, then it's inevitable that we're not going to progress. So I think a vertical integration approach is the best here, but making sure that we aren't doing too much of each quality simultaneously. Otherwise, we're just going to be systemically doing too much training and not be able to actually improve in any aspect. So using a vertical integration approach, we actually train all qualities that we want to improve in the same week, and then slowly shift the emphasis over time from more general to more specific. So for example, we might have 2 strength and hypertrophy training sessions per week, 2 speed training sessions per week, and 1 or 2 endurance training sessions per week. That way we're training every single quality in the same week, and then each individual quality can be periodized in a way that takes us from more general to more specific based on where we want to peak. So I don't think each of these qualities necessarily interferes too much with one another. It's more so that you can't dedicate too much volume to each individual quality. Otherwise, like we said, you're just going to be doing too much. So rather than interfering, it's more about distributing where you want to prioritize different qualities and how much time and volume you can allocate to each of those qualities. The last part of the question where he asks about how to combine the different aspects with team training when you're in season. So the good thing about training for in-season for soccer for this example is that, so the soccer training in season and the competitive matches are going to take care of some of those qualities already. So that's going to take care of endurance work for the most part, agility work for the most part, and potentially a little bit of speed work. So when you're doing in-season sessions, you might need to just do a little bit of plyometrics and linear speed work, and then the rest of it's taken care of already from those sessions, so that really all you need to do is your strength and hypertrophy work if you want to in the gym. So that's probably roughly how I would go about juggling all those different qualities at once. And I have plenty of videos on my channel on vertical integration and how to periodize training for team sport and field sports. Next question is how to recover in the best way without any additional equipment. Interesting question here, and I think recovery is a misunderstood topic for the most part. I don't think recovery is a thing that you necessarily do in addition to training. Recovery is more about managing how much total training load you're doing versus how much rest you're giving yourself. There is only, like we said, a certain amount of total training you can do throughout the week, and if you go beyond that, there's nothing you can do additional to actually reduce fatigue on top of that. So you don't actually need any specific equipment to recover. It's more about just making sure you're planning your training effectively and you're not doing so much that you can't even recover from that. Another aspect of injuries and recovery is how you change your training load over time. So this goes for any sort of training qualities, resistance training, speed training, running, endurance, everything. We want to always have really slow and gradual changes in load over time, not sudden spikes or declines in load. For example, if you haven't done a certain type of training for a long period of time and you want to get back into that, don't immediately ramp up that volume straight away to what you were originally doing. Really slowly, stepwise go up to that volume so that your body can actually acclimate to that new demand, because it's not prepared for that. Or even if you implement a new exercise or a new type of training, anything like that, we want slow acclimation to that new training stimulus, not a sudden spike in volume or new exercise or whatever it is. So good thing here is that you don't need any additional equipment, and hopefully that helps you understand recovery a little bit better rather than thinking about recovery as an additional thing you need to do on top of training. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.